Good afternoon, everyone. So this session is a little bit different from the rest of those for today. What we're planning to do is spend a bit of time telling you what it's like working at the IFS, and then there'll be time for any questions for people who want to know about life here, what it's like here, and the idea is to try and encourage people who to apply to become economists at IFS. Hopefully the work you'll see throughout the day will get your interest in working as an economist in public policy and encourage people to apply, if not to the IFS, then to other jobs in public policy. So I'm Carl Emmerson, I'm Deputy Director here at the IFS. On my left is Peter Levell, a Senior Research Economist, and Polly Simpson, a Research Economist. They'll both talk for a few minutes about how they ended up doing what they're doing now and what their life looks like, and then we'll break for questions. Okay, shall we, I don't know who wants to go first?
Okay, sure. So I'm Peter Levell. I'll tell you a bit about myself. So I've been working at the IFS for 9 years now, and I got into that. So I started with an undergraduate degree I did at UCL in economics, and then I did a master's degree at LSE, and then I went straight from the master's degree to working at IFS. And since I've joined IFS, so part of the time I'm working as a research economist, and I'm also a part-time PhD student now at UCL. So if you have questions about that, we can talk about that a bit later. So how did I end up at IFS? So I didn't really actually, at the point I applied, I didn't actually know that much about the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So I'd come to the public lectures, these public lectures, and I enjoyed them. And the only reason I applied is that I was not really sure what I wanted to do, and then someone told me, well, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, their deadline is coming up, it's at the end of the week. If it's now or never if you want to apply there. So I sort of went in and I filled in the form.
You didn't say that in interview.
No. I don't think I've ever told you this before, actually, this story. So I'm quite glad things actually turned out that way, though, because when I turned up at the interview, I didn't really know what to expect, so I wasn't actually that nervous. And I think that's one of the reasons I did, obviously well enough. And then after the interview, they arranged a little tour of the office, and as part of that, you ask people what they're doing, and then I found out, well, actually this is quite interesting stuff that people are working on. I quite like to work here, so that all worked out quite well. But the key thing when I was thinking about careers, so the key thing for me was I really enjoyed the economics content of the courses I was doing, and wanted to make sure that I was working a job where I not only get to apply what I learned, but I also continue to develop and continue developing as an economist afterwards. And that ruled out certain city careers for me. I wasn't interested in those kind of things. So the kind of jobs I was interested in were economic consulting, the Bank of England, Government Economic Service, and the IFS. Because the IFS, though, the application deadline is a bit earlier than those, I ended up getting an offer before I had a chance to apply for those kind of things. But those are all kind of good sorts of jobs if you want to do that kind of thing. So what I do now is I work in the sector which is now called Industrial Organisation and Demand, but I work on sort of consumption questions about the consumer behaviour, consumption and house prices, how they're linked. At IFS, the sector you're assigned to, it sort of determines some things, but it doesn't determine entirely what you end up working on, so you have some discretion to choose your own research projects. And at the point where you're a senior research economist, also the responsibility to try and fund those research projects. So recently I decided that Brexit was going to be one of the big defining issues in a lot of economic debates for the next generation. I kind of wanted to be a part of that, so I changed course a bit and started doing labour economics to answer questions about Brexit, and that's been going on. So we then applied for some funding from the SRC, we got a project together, got some colleagues to work on it, and we're at the point of nearly producing a second paper on Brexit's labour market impacts. But I think I've droned on for longer than I was supposed to. So yes, so we can talk about more things in questions, but otherwise I'll hand over to Polly.
Sure. Hello. Is this what? Polly. Hello. Right, I'm going to start with myself. So I did economics and management at Oxford, and then I did also something I maybe haven't told Carl about. I did economics, but I didn't love economics until my third year when I started having public economics lectures. And as part of our public economics course, we had a version of the lectures that you saw today. And I thought, oh, actually, the economics of public policy is very interesting. And so I then thought to apply for two things. I applied to the GES, to the civil service, to do their economics jobs, and I also applied to the IFS. And plot twist, I didn't get into the IFS. I got into the civil service. Then I went to the civil service, and I was in the Department for Education for a year, where I worked on vocational education and apprenticeships and 16 to 19, all of that sort of stuff. And then I went to the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, as it was called then. I think it's now called BASE, which is not a very good acronym, where I worked on the steel industry, and I was essentially given the question, should we save the steel industry? Because I started working on it when steel, the prices for steel completely tanked, so that was quite challenging, but really fun. And then I went to one of the IFS annual lectures, and I got an email from Paul Johnson saying, hello, we're looking to hire some people outside of the normal cycle. Would you be interested in reapplying? And then I went in to talk to him, and then they offered me a job. So then I started working at the IFS again. It's very different. If you're interested in more about the difference between the civil service and the IFS, feel free to ask when we get to the questions. But basically, in the civil service, you work on very specific things while you have a particular job, but then over your career, you move across a whole range of different things. So I think an example of how specific it can be is that I was the lead economist on waste electrical equipment in the UK, which was niche. But then, and also the work you're doing is very reactive, and it's led by the priorities of ministers, and you have, whereas here you might think, oh, that question is interesting, let's work on a project that will last 3 years so that we can get a very rigorous answer to whatever question we're interested in. I had things like, you've got 2 weeks, should we save the steel industry, which is quite a different time scale. But now I work here where projects are much longer, and you maybe you start from a couple of subject areas and then you broaden out over time rather than kind of jumping around from different areas. So when I started here, I started working on local government finance and the funding of the police, which is, one of them was kind of a more policy project. It was what's going on in local government finance reform, who do we think that's going to affect, what's that going to do to geographic inequality in public service spending. And then I was working on this police project, which was a more academic thing, which was trying to understand why different parts of the country, if you give them the option, will raise more money to spend on police than other parts of the country. And doing that sort of thing helps you think about, well, what happens if we devolve taxes? Who's going to spend more? Who won't spend more? So I'm more junior than Peter, but I've now been here for 3 years. So I'm at the point where I'm starting to, express some preferences about the sorts of things I want to work on. And so one thing is that I was given the choice, do you want to carry on doing more work on social care, which was an element of local government finance that I was doing quite a lot of work in, or do you want to go and work on this project with an academic at UCL, which will be quite technical, but it'll be about predicting the impact of transport investments, using kind of like the forefront of what the academics have figured out on these residential sorting models. And I went, that sounds fun, I'll do that. So I was put in the position of a very junior person on a very complicated project, but it's been very fun, and I've been really enjoying learning about all the technical things that you have to do that sort of work. And I also, over the summer, we have our annual report called the Green Budget, which is where we set out the issues that we think are facing the Chancellor. It goes out before the budget. I think the idea is that we do it to try and set the context of what the media are talking about when they read that budget. And in that, kind of like Peter, I thought, housing is one of these really important issues of the time. We haven't written loads about housing policy. I think it would be really cool to do something on that. And I put together a proposal. It was unbelievably ambitious, and I received a lot of help from kind of senior people who respected, I think, that I was trying to do something on this, and gave me a lot of help refining it into something that was much smaller and answerable, and then I kind of saw that through working with a senior co-author that I recruited. And I didn't recruit them to the job, I just persuaded them to work on it with me, and then got to present that at the big event. And so that was quite an exciting, I'm kind of at that cusp of when you start to be able to propose things yourself and people give you a lot of support to see those through, even if you're not quite ready. I think that's...
Just mention the MSc.
Oh yeah, and I'm doing a part-time MSc. So like Peter's doing a PhD, I came without a master's, and so not September just gone, the September before that, I started doing a master's part-time at UCL. It's normally a 1-year course, instead I'm doing it over 2 years. My contract's changed, so I go down to 75% hours. I'm part-time, and I go to lectures, and I come back to the office, and I have time off to do study leave, and it's been... I don't think there's many other jobs where you would notice that it's quite so complementary to the work I'm doing. I'd be going to lectures and I'd be learning how to do some stuff, and then I'd go back to and I'd have a meeting, and then I'd realise I'm really glad I went to that lecture, otherwise I wouldn't have understood what Lars is talking about. So, and that's been really fun and a really nice way. I really enjoy it, and it's very common. Anybody who comes without a master's pretty much goes and does the master's at UCL, so I think it's a very nice way of doing it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll open the floor to questions. And clearly, we're currently thinking a lot about our annual recruitment round, the deadline for which is the 18th of January. So those of you like Peter can see that deadline coming. So that's for our kind of entry-level economist jobs, which we currently run once a year. So I can talk a bit about that process if people like, or more generally about life at IFS. Okay.
So I'm an undergrad. Finishing off my undergrad in economics, and I'm also applying for a master's at UCL next year, which will be part-time in public policy. So I wanted to ask, what's your master's in, and what's it like, flexibility-wise?
So the master's in economics. What do you mean by flexibility-wise?
Like, as in, how you're working part-time.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you working part-time, working full-time, and doing a part-time master's?
I'm working part-time, but I guess how part-time I work depends on how busy I am in the office. My master's is not flexible in the sense that the lectures are where the lectures are, and most people on the course aren't part-time. So I'm very lucky that IFS is very close to UCL, so if I have a lecture, I leave 10 minutes before I go to my lecture, and then I come back to the office, I carry on working. They were flexible in the sense that I often get to choose when my tutorials will be within the set of when tutorials are going to be, which is nice for concentrating all your time. You're going to be at uni within a couple of days. But
and how many hours a week are you at uni?
It varies by term, depending on the workload, but I guess this term I'll be at uni for 6 hours a week. Last time I was there for 5 hours a week. That time last year I was there for 10 hours a week. So. Yeah.
I mean, essentially the way we work it is that so people who join IFS as research economists who haven't got masters pretty much all do master's degrees, simply because having to be a professional economist, that's essentially what you need to do now. And usually people come here, work for a year first to get used to the place, and then start the course part-time. We reduce their pay and their time over the year by 25%, so they go 75% hours and 75% pay for the 2 years in which the course will take place, and then we manage that as flexibly as possible in terms of when the lectures are. If you're doing more courses one term, less the next term. The IFS pays for 2/3 of the fees. The individual has to pay 1/3 of the fees, and IFS also provides some additional study leave as well around exam time, which you don't have to take a pay cut for. But in terms of, Polly's not expected to do 75% every single week. What she's expected to do is think about the demands on her job when we've got particular deadlines, when she will need to work harder, but also when there are particular deadlines where there's perhaps more coursework or more things required from UCL. So we try and manage that as best we can. Clearly, sometimes there'll be moments when Polly's more stressed and moments when she's less stressed, depending on how well we're doing with that.
So you guys fund part of the fees if someone's doing a master's?
Yeah, so the subsidy we are providing, if you like, is 2/3 of the fees plus a couple of weeks of 2 weeks of study
10 days.
and 10 days of study leave.
And is that only for specific masters?
Oh, well, we would expect there to be a high economics content in the course because it's about being a professional economist, and therefore it's complementary to the job. As Polly says, we get benefits from Polly going to the lectures and coming back with those skills. So it would have to be in something with a strong economics content. In terms of where, we don't mind at all, but it has to be compatible with the job, and we've arranged for UCL to offer a part-time option. So I don't know if other universities are offering part-time options. Birkbeck does. That's where I did my master's. So I did it in the evenings at Birkbeck. I'm much older than these two. UCL didn't have that option at the time. Sometimes people say, oh, what about going to LSE? Well, they don't offer a part-time option, and we don't have any sway with them. So, and geographically, obviously, UCL works, Birkbeck works, LSE would work. Doing it part-time outside of London just wouldn't work, because how would you go to the lecture and then be back in the office?
Yeah. I would also say that the UCL Masters in Economics is brilliant. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's a very good course.
So I have two questions. First is, how did doing a PhD while working at the IFS works? Is it the same as a master's? And also, if you join IFS at some point, how much choice do you have in terms of doing more academic work or more policy-oriented work?
Peter, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, so the PhD, the arrangement is, so again it's at UCL. The PhD starts with a taught component, which for a full-time student would be a 1-year MRes course. So the difference is, because you're doing it part-time, that you stretch that over 2 years. I think you're 80% salary for the duration of those 2 years. And it's a similar arrangement. You get time off for the lectures, you get study leave, and you can organise that time how you want. Once that's over, then you become a full-time research student. The idea then is your research at your PhD marries up with the research you're doing at IFS, and then you're fully funded by the IFS for the rest of the PhD, so you don't have to worry about funding questions. And then you just carry on doing that part time, and it's quite a good deal because you the work you're doing at PhD does 90% of it overlap with what you're doing at IFS if you arrange things properly. And then the second question was,
well, on the first one,
okay.
So I think we pay all of the fees in the case of the PhD.
For the MRes course.
Is that true?
Oh, you do, yes. So. I was thinking. So you take a salary cut for while you're doing it part time.
Yes. So you take a 20% pay reduction and a 20% time reduction. You have all of the fees paid for, because with a master's, we think actually there's a lot of private benefits. For example, you on average will earn a lot more in your subsequent life if you do a master's degree than if you don't, at least on average. That's not true of a PhD, at least on average. So we think the private benefits are significant on the masters. With the PhD, we'll pick up all of the tuition fees. It's a 20% reduction in time and pay. I'm not sure why that's different from the masters to the.
I think it's 80% rather than 75%.
Yeah, so it's not a big difference. There's some study leave, but the key is to make sure that the research component that you then, when you're through the exams, you go onto the research component. You're employed a full time at IFS, and you want to make sure that your research is really well integrated with what you want to do in your PhD. It wouldn't work any other way. And so, as Peter says, over time, essentially, you're doing your day job, you're earning your IFS wage, you're getting that funded, you're doing research that we value, that we want to be doing, and then that contributes to your PhD. Sometimes people need a little bit of time off towards the end to write it up and pull it together as a PhD, but largely it's done over, it takes a few years, but it's done while working here full time.
Yeah. And then you had a second question about academic and policy work. So the key thing about IFS is that you're expected to do both. So I've always seen that as an advantage over working at universities. So on the one hand, you're doing these long-term academic research projects, but at the same time, you're talking to policymakers, you're talking to the media, you're making sure that findings, where relevant or where you can inject them into the policy debate usefully, you're communicating that. And we do that much more, much better, to be honest, than the university department would. In terms of freedom, so over time you get more and more freedom because you start choosing your own projects and you're expected to, you get the freedom to choose your own projects and also the responsibility to ensure that they're funded, that other people working on are funded, that they deliver good outputs, either whether peer-reviewed publications or big policy outputs. So I've probably chosen to go down much more down the academic side than other people would, but there are people that work much more on policy because they've decided that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I think it's right. Everyone here is doing a bit of both. We think that actually there's complementarities between understanding the policy institutions, policy reforms, what policymakers want to hear, with doing rigorous research that's scientifically robust. But people people go on different paths through that naturally. Whereas I said virtually everyone who comes here without a master's as a research economist does one, and it pretty much is everyone. About half the researchers here are doing or have a PhD, about half are not doing one and don't have one. So it's a genuine choice whether to do a PhD or not. We can accommodate either route. It's not a prerequisite in any sense. And I guess the people who are choosing to do the PhD are naturally choosing a slightly more academic path through IFS. Their 5-10 year plan might be to go and get an academic position, whereas the people who are choosing not to do a PhD, that won't be their 5 or 10 year plan. But everyone's expected to be doing a bit of both, and that's how we, or at least in all areas of IFS research, we have to be doing both. Individuals within those teams might play slightly different roles, but we can accommodate that. So there was a question from Mark.
Yeah. How much sort of other training do you do? So you do a lot of sort of public speaking, a lot of communicating with journalists and with broadcasters, etc. Is that also, do you get sort of extra training on that, or do you just spend time with the
Yeah, we have quite a lot of other bits of training. So I think we run quite a good, I think it's been developing over several years, but quite a good induction program for when new REs join, and they're mostly a sessions offered by people that work at IFS. So I've had ones on how to write, what it means to be doing academic research, and how to figure out what the contribution of your work is. I've done media training where we had a camera in and we had to practice doing media interviews with Carl and with Paul. I've had we really recently had some training where we tried to come up with our elevator pitch for our work, and then we kind of submit those in advance and practice with everyone. It was about communicating your work and how you communicate to different audiences. I've had lots of other training about lots of different things that relate to the different aspects of our work, in particular data classes. So a lot of what we do is data work. It's a very heavy component of what we do is data work. I would say 70% of my time is data work, and so we have lots of on-the-job people helping you teaching you how to use different whatever statistical packages you need to use, but we also have 4 1-hour sessions on data that are run whenever they think that they need to be run. But yes, that's sort of a 2-hour workshop here and there, a half-day workshop that are done to kind of cater to those different elements of the job, mostly run by people within IFS. Yeah.
I mean, most of the training to do the job is actually done by doing the job. You're working in a team with 2 or 3 other people, learning about how to do research, how to write, how to communicate. You get feedback on the presentations you're giving, on the drafts of reports you're doing, on the data work that you're doing continuously. So that's most of the training. As Polly says, we've been introducing more and more kind of 2-hour sessions on different aspects. Clearly the master's course is a huge piece of external training that we partly pay for and provide. We do sometimes use other external training courses for advanced media training, for example, as needs be.
I would say on the learning on the job that people here I found are very good at going the extra step to help you learn when you're learning things on the job. I've worked with people who actively encouraged me to write the first draft of a press release, and then they've sat and gone through with me how they would have written a press release differently. And I think there's just small things like that I think people here don't just think the way to learn on the job is just to be thrown into things and then see how you do. I think there's definitely a bit of actively trying to help you develop to do the new things that you haven't done before.
And in terms of programming, is that mostly data?
I think it varies. I think most people, I would say the majority of people do Stata for lots of their work. I know that I have more recently been doing lots of stuff on R, and I know a few people use MATLAB for more of if they do more structural stuff. But I think state is what almost everyone learns when they first join.
Yeah. Which is all taught on the job as well. So it's not like we require people to, in most jobs here, we don't require people to come with that as a pre-existing skill. We'll teach them or provide the opportunity for them to go and learn that if it's needed for the projects they're working on. But everyone here can work in Stata. Some people can work in extra things depending on the type of work they're doing.
I'd never opened Stata when I joined. So.
I'd like to know about your internship program for undergraduates. What are the requirements and how is it structured?
Yeah, so we have a summer student scheme that also has a deadline of the 18th of January. It runs, so we're looking there for people who are maybe they're between their in the summer they'll be between their second and third year perhaps of an undergraduate degree. Maybe they'll be finishing their undergraduate degree and expecting to go on to do a master's degree. They'll be doing they'll be doing a course with a lot of economics in it. They'll be working here, usually it's for 6 weeks, sometimes we extend that a little bit if the project they're working on requires a bit more input. The idea is they'll come here and work on a project for that period of time closely with a senior economist here, learn a bit about the literature and a bit about the data and try and run some regressions, perhaps look at, give a presentation on their last day about what they found. And often we then use that piece of work to build into, say, a project proposal or to a further piece of work that we're doing. I think there's anything else on that. It's a good taster for people who want to be research economists here. So several people who have got full-time jobs here were previously summer students. And certainly we've now started that if people come as a summer student and we think that they had a really good time here and they're a good match for us, at the end of that we tell them we really want them to apply and we'll guarantee that they'll get an interview. So there's an advantage there as well. They won't get rejected from their application for research economist position if we like them during their 6 weeks.
I would say that it seems, I haven't been a summer student and I haven't had a summer student, but it does seem like people try really hard to make what you're doing as a summer student a self-contained project that you are kind of doing for yourself and that it will clearly feed into something, so that, I don't know, you don't come and you do some data work for 6 weeks that's never going to go anywhere. You come and you do something and it's tangible and you can see it through all the way to the end and you can understand how what you're doing is feeding into the bigger picture. And so I think in that way it's quite a nice introduction to applied economics.
Yeah, so to give a concrete example, in fact last summer myself and a senior economist here have a project looking at the pension arrangements of the self-employed. Now it's a big project and that could never be done in 6 weeks, but one aspect of that is to think about the state pension rights of the self-employed. So we got a summer student in, that summer student had to look at the state pension rules, how they relate to the self-employed, how they've changed over time. So the extent to which the self-employed can qualify for the basic state pension or additional state pensions or the new state pension that we have. And then also to get their hands on some data and look at how many people how many self-employed people had sufficient income to qualify for those different state pension rights, or if they weren't qualifying on income grounds, perhaps they had young children that would get them credits towards it. So in 6 weeks they weren't able to do the whole big project. We just ignored private pension provision, which is the thing that's going to take us months to work on, but they did do the majority of what we wanted on the state pension side. That was manageable in 6 weeks, to spend 2 weeks learning about the state pension rules and writing them down, and then 4 weeks playing with some data and thinking about what are the incomes of the self-employed and to what extent of those with low incomes got children, for example, and therefore qualifying for the state pension in other ways.
And in terms of that project that you're working on, do you get much choice in who you're assigned to, or should you be thinking about who you might want to work with?
So for summer students, no, there isn't any choice. There's a set of 6 weeks projects that we'll have, and we'll just allocate them as we think people are best suited. And I guess if somebody has a particular project that they think needs somebody, for example, who's got a particular interest in, say, development economics, or someone who's perhaps on that transition between third year and masters rather than someone between second and third year, we'll make that match essentially. For full-time positions here, again, we're an organisation where we've got 7 or 8 different teams here, and not every team will have a vacancy in every year, we might typically recruit, say, 3 research economists in a year. So someone that comes here and says, well, I've got a really strong area in X, can I work in that area? Well, it depends on whether we've even got a vacancy in that area. There's about a 50% chance we will have. We'll try and match preferences where we can, but ultimately, people here are doing very similar jobs regardless of whether they're working on education policy or on tax design or on pensions policy. What they're doing is learning about the academic literature. They're thinking about data and what you can learn, what interesting questions you can learn from those data, and thinking about what incentives people face given the institutions they're in. And as Peter said, over time you get opportunity to move between areas or look at synergies between different areas. So the fact that we're split into lots of small teams means we have lots of people working across those teams. So for example, somebody who was put in the tax team, who was working on that for a period of time, might decide they want to think about tax and how that relates to higher education, and they might want to start working with people in the education team. So we kind of develop projects in that way, lots of small teams and lots of people working across them. So you're not fixed forever in that area that you'll work in, but we can't give people free choice, because essentially we'll have, in the recruitment round that comes up, we will have probably 3 jobs for, in specific areas where somebody's come up with a research idea, they've got a vacancy because they've got funding to do something. We need someone to come in and do that job. But we also want to develop them over time so they can contribute to that project and then to further projects and make, eventually develop a research agenda of their own.
Do you ever employ people on a part-time basis?
Well, yes. So explicitly, the people who are doing masters or doing PhDs in the course phases are part-time. I don't think we've had examples of people who've come and joined and been part-time from the off, but we have people who work part-time, for example, because they want to do something else with part of their lives, like look after children. That's pretty common. So certainly, I think people might come here, join, work full-time for a year, then go and do a master's, go 75% for a couple of years, then come back full-time, and then maybe they'll have a child and they want to reduce their hours, and that's completely fine. And the majority of people in the building aren't working here full-time, so it's not an environment
They've sort of been fully immersed for a
Yes, I think, and certainly with the masters, we like people to work full-time at first. Well, we like people to work for a year here before getting into that, so they can settle themselves in. I think we'd have to think carefully about how to make that work if someone wanted to be part-time first. If they wanted to study, it would also be it might be difficult to make that link. But I think, we're certainly open to that, and we'd certainly be happy to talk about that and work out how we could make it work. One of the 3 of us isn't full-time anyway. No, me.
Huh?
Me.
Oh, you?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh, you're studying, so it's kind of that's not a holiday.
How many projects does the IFS run concurrently, and what do you do at the end, like when you're done with a project?
How many
The whole IFS.
What? So on an individual basis.
Well, I reckon we've got about 60 economists working here, and I reckon we've got about 60 projects. So I reckon that on average people are working on about 3 different projects with about 3 other staff members. So I think that's roughly how it would stack up.
That's about right.
What do you do when a project ends? Well, actually, it's kind of like what do you do when your research is finished? That doesn't really happen. You have a particular output that will be produced, but of course, as a project develops, you'll be thinking about, well, how can I extend this? What other ideas can I have within it? And at a more junior level, it might be, how do I push this research forwards within the existing project? At a more senior level, it will be, well, what comes next? What can we be doing? What spin-offs can we do? How do we push this further forwards? So it doesn't come to an end in the sense of the research agenda doesn't come to an end, but you do get a publication at some point or a particular output at some point, but it's all part of a journey.
I feel like there are definitely phases of projects where you're maybe you're just starting an idea and you spend a lot of time reading about the policy area or the literature and finding all your data, and then you kind of progress into the doing lots of data analysis phase, and then you progress into the writing up into whatever format you think is most appropriate, be that a working paper or a presentation or a series of tweets. I guess not all of them. I don't think we ever have a research project that we've written up just as tweets. but maybe that's for the future. But yeah, as Carl says, lots of things don't end.
Yeah. Well, typically you'll be working on a lot of things, but some things will be right at the end. So you're just dealing with peer review, you're sort of dealing with reviewer comments, or kind of, at that stage. Other things will be right at the beginning, where you're just coming up with ideas and talking to people and trying to assemble a team. And then there'll be about 3 projects that you're working on, kind of day to day, where you know what you're doing, and but you haven't quite got to the stage where you want to submit it, but you'll be submitting to conferences and things like that. And the grants that come, they're typically time limited, but you hardly ever have published the paper, almost never have published the paper before the end of the grant. So you do the main piece of work while the grant's continuing, and then you might seek additional funding to extend it in various directions, or you might just carry on in your own time sometimes.
Sorry, I understand that you get external funding for various individual projects, presumably not all projects. Where does the IFS get its money from?
Sure. So we don't have any endowment. We don't own our building, for example, or anything like that. We don't have very much money in the bank. So we have to raise money for all of the research that we do. Our main funder is the Economic and Social Research Council, which pays for social science research across UK universities. We have a research centre at the IFS, which has now become a research institute. In total, about half of our income comes from the Economic and Social Research Council. That's both that centre, but also additional money will apply to them for. The rest we will apply to charitable trusts like the Nuffield Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Our development team applies to places like the World Bank and the IMF for money. We also get money from places like the Levell Foundation, other.
The ERC, I guess.
Yeah, the European Research Council is about 10% of our income at the moment. So a wide range of funders. Actually, the composition of that's changed quite a lot over time. If you went back sort of 10 years ago, it would have been a lot more from some government departments where we were doing a lot of research for the Department of Work and Pensions, Department for Education. We do much less of that because there's less of that available, and we've started to do more of slightly other things. So that's where it's a range of sources, the SRC being particularly important. And that centre, which is about 30% of our income, that's incredibly important because it's a 5-year tranche of money, which allows us, when we bid for it, to be quite speculative about what we're going to do. It sets a long-run base, and then we try and co-fund activities outside of that and extensions to build on that. So that's an incredibly important part of our funding.
Yeah. So I'll just add that, because this is something about IFS that I really like and liked from the outset, was the fact that we only take funding from sources that will allow us to keep our independence. There's never going to be a funder telling you, there's never going to be a point in your IFS career where you can't write that because the funder says no. The SRC, they provide things at arm's length. You tell them the project, you tell them research methods you're going to do, and then you do it, and then they have no say over the results of what you publish or anything. Yes, and that's always been.
Yeah, so crucial there is both who do we take the money from, the reality of that independence and the perception of that independence, and also we retain the right to publish what we find. So when we were doing work for government departments, we were insisting that we had the right to publish the results of the work that we were doing.
And we do turn down funding if they don't agree to that condition.
There's one right at the very back.
Hi, yes, I'm on placement with the GES at the moment, and there's quite a few of my colleagues here today. And I think it was quite easy to relate with what Polly was saying before about our work being quite reactive, aligned to current government priorities and such. And it's quite easy though to see how the work we do has like a direct impact, like budget and stuff. How would you say like the IFS, the work they do, how is the impact and influence of that work different?
Yeah. So yes, it's certainly trying to think about what impact we have. We certainly could measure a whole load of metrics, like how many times we publish in top journals, how many times we appear on the media. So there's a kind of outputs that we can measure. In terms of actually leading to better policy outcomes, it's clearly much harder to know, well, what would policy look like if IFS didn't exist or if this particular piece of research hadn't happened. There are some examples of government policies where the government itself has explicitly cited a piece of IFS work to justify what it's doing. That doesn't mean that we caused it, but provides some encouragement. We also know of times when policies that were, in our view, not very good were thought about and then didn't happen, and that's an important part of policy impact too. So one thing we do is talk to political parties, their representatives, about what they're thinking about. They sometimes bounce ideas off us. We are open about the fact we do that. We're not open about what the content of that is, but essentially we reveal to them what we would say were they to announce that policy publicly, what we would say in response, and we hope by doing that we encourage them to announce good things and hope them to refine less good things. And that's that sort of service that we offer to the main political parties is, it's not uncommon for them to take it up. It's usually done by opposition parties, I guess, because those in government have the GES that they can use. But it makes us feel that we're having, confident that we're having impact there.
I'd say another thing that I've noticed is that sometimes I think a good outcome from what we do is getting some ideas that we've thought about by people who matter. So I know that, I did a piece of work about the interaction between ideas of centralising social care funding and what that would do to the local government finance system, which wasn't really a thing that anybody was talking about, and we're kind of in quite a good position that we work across lots of different areas, and those are two things that people don't think about in a joined up way normally. We wrote a report about this, and then I know that somebody who is on the advisory board for the social care green paper came up to me and she said, I really liked your report, I thought it was really interesting and added something to debate. And so I think one thing that we do sometimes hear from people, that specific people have read what we have said, and somebody from Cabinet Office said the same thing to me. And the other day somebody from the MHCLG, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, said, oh, you wrote about the importance of supply in your housing green budget. That was really useful for us talking to ministers, because there are some people saying that supply is not important. We really valued your argument as a thing that we could use to talk to ministers. So I think that kind of influencing key people is a thing that I think we do well, because we're quite respected and we're able to do that.